welcome the Times Literature Festival. I'm Jairam Ramesh, and I will be in conversation with Dr. Ghee Bowman, who's written this wonderful book that's just been released called The Indian Contingent, The Forgotten Muslim Soldiers of the Battle of Dunkirk. It's published by Macmillan. It's beautifully written, wonderfully produced, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Bowman. We all know about Dunkirk. We all know about the evacuation of 338,000 Allied soldiers from the coastal city of Dunkirk in France in the months of May, June of 1940, one of the great events of World War II. But what is not known by the present generation is the fact that out of these 338,000, there were 300 soldiers of the Indian Army. Almost all of them were from Punjab, and almost all of them were Muslims, who subsequently went on to have careers in Pakistan and in England. So, Dr. Bowman, let me begin by asking you. You're a historian, you worked in diverse fields, and you probably have seen the great classic of 2017, Christopher Nolan's film, Dunkirk, which hit world headlines. How come you produce this very unusual book of a small group of soldiers whose story is simply not known and one wouldn't even have imagined?
Well, thank you, Jairam, and thank you for that lovely introduction. The reason I got interested in this story is because I thought it was such a great story. It was a story that grabbed me and held me from when I started to read. Well, first of all, I found some photographs. So it started with photos. I was doing a project about multicultural history in the city where I live, which is Exeter in the southwest of England. And I came across these three photos of Indian soldiers in 1940 in my part of Britain with puggaries, with mules. And I thought, that's interesting. I never knew there was such a thing in the war. So I went to the archives in London and I found this fantastic document, which was the War Service Diary of the 25th Animal Transport Company of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. And this told the story of how they started in Punjab late in 1939, came down to Bombay, to Mumbai, sailed across the sea, went through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean and arrived in France in December 26, 1939, and how they then went on from there and were eventually, at the end of May, were on the beaches of Dunkirk and escaped from that terrible situation. And as I read this diary in the National Archives, in this very kind of official place in London, I was so moved by this story that tears came to my eyes. I started crying as I was reading this, because I thought this is just such an interesting story that nobody knows about. As you said, 338,000 French and British soldiers escaped, and there were these 300 and so Indians amongst them that nobody had known about. And I thought, this is a story that needs to be told.
Well, the story of Indian Army in World War I, also known as the Great War, there have been many papers and books on this that have emerged over the last decade particularly. Mm-hmm. But the story of the Indian Army's contributions in World War II relatively is lesser known. While the Indian Army's operations in West Asia, or what is called the Middle East, has been written about, its activities in Europe have certainly not got the attention they deserve. And you perhaps would do, you have done a really fantastic service in highlighting the contribution of these Indian soldiers. Are there other such examples in the European situation, Dr. Bowman?
Well, not many. I mean, these, as you said, this was a very small unit. There were never more than about 4,000 of them. And as they, after they had left France, they then spent several years in Britain. And they became, in fact, the only units of the Indian Army ever to be posted to Britain. Apart from them, there were some Indian soldiers in Greece, both in 1941 and then towards the end of the war. And then there were substantial amounts of Indian Army in Italy. So after the campaign in North Africa had finished, the 8th Army crossed over into Italy and spent a very long, difficult campaign battling their way up the long boot shape of Italy. And the Indian 4th and 5th divisions were very important within that. And particularly, for example, Monte Cassino, which was a very hard and difficult battle. The Indians were very much involved in that. But
So how come, on the books on Dunkirk and this great 2017 film on Dunkirk, there's really no mention of the Indian contingent at all?
well, I think they were forgotten. I mean, I think that's, they are mentioned in a few contemporary accounts. I mean, there's lots of newspaper reports about them, film footage from the time, some very good film footage, and newspaper reports about from the places they were posted in throughout the UK. But it didn't; those memories didn't really stick. They didn't really stay in the British public consciousness. And they were, yeah, they were swept away, really swept away by the tide of events, I guess. I mean, the Second World War was so big and so global and so complicated that these guys were just ignored.
Well, one very interesting point you make in your final chapter, very poignant final chapter, is that actually in the 40s and perhaps even in the early 50s, this contingent was very much part of the public discourse, books, articles, newsreels. So it's very much part of the discourse. But then they got forgotten. So there was an initial period of remembrance, but then there is this long amnesia from the early 1950s onwards. It's a very interesting cycle that you draw attention to.
Yes, it is, and I find it fascinating and frustrating. I mean, I'm someone who I've been interested in the Second World War, all my life, and there have been snippets of the broader Indian Army that I have come across over the years. I mean, there's a film made in about 1970 by Disney called Bedknobs and Broomsticks. I don't know if you remember that one, but that was and there's a sequence in that film. It's set during the war. There's a sequence in that film where they're singing a song in London, and suddenly there are 4 Sikh soldiers dancing, doing a traditional Indian dance on the streets of London, completely out of nowhere, and it's completely out of context and very strange. But I think that maybe the filmmakers had some inkling that there had been Indian soldiers in London during the war, and that they were kind of grabbing onto that and distorting it.
Well, it's not just Indian soldiers. The point you make, in keeping the contemporary situation in mind, the point you make is these were not just Punjabis. These were not Indians. They were also almost entirely all Muslim.
Yeah.
And so there were questions of faith. There was questions of interaction with the local society. So that's another unusual aspect of this contingent, that it was out of 300, maybe 298 were Muslims.
Indeed, yes, indeed, and their efforts to find places to pray were considerable. So everywhere they went, they were looking for somewhere where they could pray 5 times a day, and generally that would be a tent or a building that was, a barracks building. But then they did have access to the oldest mosque in Britain, which was a mosque built in 1889. Which was in a little town called Woking, still there, which is just outside of London. So they used that, and they went there as their leave centre for quite a long time. So they were able to meet their spiritual needs. Every company of 315 men had a Maulvi that was attached to them. So there was somebody there kind of, in the centre of their existence who was there to help them.
I should add that even the Imam was successfully evacuated at Dunkirk. So
Indeed,
and Imam at Dunkirk as well.
Absolutely, and he was actually lame, so I think they had to carry him along the beach. So that's quite a poignant sight to think of these guys on the beach at Dunkirk. At their head was Major Akbar Khan, who was one of the senior most Indian officers in the Indian Army at the time, and these 300 guys marching along the beach with the Stuka dive bombers coming in, the shells coming in, the smoke all around them, the British soldiers, kind of taking cover in the dunes because of the attacking aircraft. It must have been an awful, awful sight.
Now, Dr. Bowman, you have done a phenomenal amount of archival work. You've consulted the archives in England, France, Germany, Pakistan, and India, and many other archives, but the main national archives. Now, I'd like to get from you a sense of were these archives. I can imagine the British and the French archives being up to date and having a lot of material. Did you find the Indian and Pakistani archives very useful?
Yes, in Delhi, the National Archives of India were incredibly useful and quite easy to use, to be honest. And I found, for example, massive lists of names of these guys. I mean, one of my quests has been to identify as many of them as possible by name. And in the National Archives in India, there were a lot of them who were named, so that was really useful. The Center for Armed Forces Historical Research was very, very useful. That's in Delhi. And Squadron Leader Rana China, who is in charge there, he was extremely helpful in digging out documents from private collections. I had less luck in Pakistan, I have to admit. I tried to get into the Punjab archives. I couldn't get into the National Archives in Islamabad. So that wasn't so helpful. But what I did do in Pakistan was I met lots of families of the soldiers. Unfortunately, all the soldiers themselves are now dead, but I was able to meet, children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, and get an enormous amount of individual personal testimony and documents, photographs as well, which was incredibly rewarding, very, very rewarding.
Well, I found very interesting, given the debates that are taking place in India right now, some of the, interviews that you did and some of the archival material that you unearthed showed that quite a number of members of the contingent were not in favor of partition, in 1947. And they were actually, sort of quite critical of the British, exit based on the partition of Punjab, particularly, since all of them happened to come from Punjab anyway. So.
Yes, and I think the political situation must have been very complicated for them, because I mean, if you were, for an Indian in 1939, it's a difficult decision to decide to support the British, to support the British by fighting in their army. And obviously, I mean, these guys were all professional soldiers, and most of them had been in the army for many years already. So it was their job, but nevertheless, it must have caused a lot of tension. And you can see that when some of them ended up as prisoners of war. So one company was captured in northern France and spent 5 years in prisoner of war camps. And they had a difficult decision to make, because Subhas Chandra Bose came to Germany and tried to recruit them into the German army. And in fact, he had some success with that. And several of them, about 30 of them, did join the German army, the 950th Regiment. And thereby made a political decision to go that way. So whereas others, the ones who were captured, escaped from the prisoners of war camp and got back to Britain. So the politics of it are very complicated and fascinating.
Well, the 1939 decision, was a decision that was taken by Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy of India, that India will join the war, much against the opposition, of Gandhi, Nehru, and all the great leaders who certainly were for democratic values, who were against fascism, but they were also against imperialism. So they looked upon imperialism and fascism as two sides of the same coin. But yeah, I mean, the 39 choice was not made for them. But later on, you write that some members of the contingent did decide to fight for the German side. But you were careful not to be judgmental, because ultimately, Germany may have been an opponent of Britain, but the ancient Cautilian maxim, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, you write about the INA, and you write about Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and so on. So, I mean, that's a very interesting segment of your book, where you talk about how people made the choice actually to fight on the German side.
Yes, and I think that was a very difficult choice. I think for some of them it was about getting better conditions and getting into a better material situation. For some of them it was definitely a political decision, and there were over 3,000 who were eventually, not just from these Indian soldiers, but from other prisoners of war who'd been captured in Italy or North Africa. There were about 3,000 of them who joined the German army, and I think there must have been always a mixture of reasons for that. But I think I think it's complicated, particularly when you think about, it shows the difference in attitudes then and now between Britain and India. What was the war for? Who was it being fighted? Who was it being fought for and by? And what were the benefits of it? And I think, of course, that changed so much in India. That changed so much when the Japanese army were knocking on the door in the northeast corner of India in 1943, 44. Then it became much more of a direct threat. And recruitment went up at that stage into the Indian army. But it wasn't, clearly there was a vast sector of Indian public opinion that was never wholly behind the war effort. And whereas in Britain, the public opinion was almost entirely behind the war effort. So, and also contrastingly, in Britain, we had conscription. So, men had to join. In India, there never was any conscription. It was always a voluntary thing.
One of the arguments made by the Congress Working Committee in October of 1939 was that we were not consulted. We were not even told. We were not even asked. We were not even requested. It was a fatwa issued by Lord Linlithgow that India shall be part of the war effort.
And at the same time, Canada, New Zealand, Australia were asked. Yeah. They made the choice. So that was always, and I think that was always rightly seen as being unjust.
How long did it take for you to do the research, and how long did the book project take, Dr. Bowman?
Well, the research has not finished. For me, the research is constantly ongoing. Last night, I met some people who were giving me some more information about these guys in the little town where I am now in Wales. But it's taken me about, I suppose the bulk of the research took about 5 years. The writing was very quick, actually. But I'd done, because I did my PhD as part of the research process. So I wrote a thesis, and then I wrote the book in about 4 months.
So tell me, you're a Quaker, and did your being a Quaker have anything to do with your extraordinary interest in this unusual area? Because Quakers are generally known to be international, ecumenical, and non-denominational. And Quakers have had a long association with the Indian subcontinent, particularly with our freedom movement. So any impact of your Quaker background on the book?
Yes, I think so. I think I would say in two respects. Firstly is that Quakers are, as you say, internationalists and strong believers in multiculturalism and in peaceful coexistence. And for me, hearing these stories about how these soldiers lived and so happily and so warmly amongst people in Britain and France, with one or two exceptions, and were able to integrate and to be welcomed. That for me was a really heartening story, which is a story for our time. I think it's a story when in Britain, there is racism, particularly racism directed against Muslims, but also against other people from South Asia and elsewhere. This is a story that we need to know, that actually back in the 40s, here in Britain, relations were good. Relations were good in this particular case. And then the second reason that it's related to or relevant to my being a Quaker is because Quakers are pacifists and I'm a pacifist. And I think that we have to try and eradicate war and eradicate the causes of war. And for me, there's something in this complicated story which actually is about international understanding and about peace and about the need for peace. And about how people can, come together and reconcile. Of course, the struggle against fascism, I think, was the major struggle of my parents' generation, and it was a struggle that was necessary. And I think if I had been born 40 years earlier, I think I would have had a very difficult decision about whether or not to be a pacifist.
Well, two Quakers. One was Horace Alexander, the other one was Agatha Harrison. Both Horace Alexander and Agatha Harrison, devout Quakers, but were profoundly influenced by the Indian freedom movement and were very close to Gandhi and Nehru also as well, and other leaders of the freedom movement. So there is a very strong Quaker influence in the 1930s and the 1940s as part of Indian history. So I was somewhat intrigued by the fact that you set out on this project, and perhaps being a Quaker had something to do with this interest. And I think you end the book of course, your book is a work of archival research, but you end the book with a plea for a greater sensitivity to multiculturalism. To living with different cultures, different religions, living in multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multi-religious societies. And I think that's a very, very powerful message that you send out, that you use history to draw lessons for contemporary challenges.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, and I think that's what history is about. People talk about rewriting history as if that's a bad thing, but history is constantly there to be reappraised and rewritten, and always has been. That's always been the purpose of history, and the way that history is done. I think if we were still writing the history of the Second World War as it was written during the 1950s, then that would be a very sad thing. And I think historians always also reflect the time and the place in which they're writing. So we need to do that, and we need to find the stories which do point us towards a better future for humankind. Definitely.
Tell me, you make one very interesting observation in the last chapter of your book, that over a period of time, while in the 1940s particularly, the contributions of contingents like this Muslim contingent from Punjab were very well recognized and acknowledged and appreciated in Britain. Over a period of time, that has got forgotten, but the Gurkhas have remained part of the British consciousness. So what accounts for this differential, a response on the part of the British public?
That's a very good question, and it's hard to trace that. But and certainly, I mean, the Indian Army in the Second World War, the Indian members won 28 Victoria Crosses. The Victoria Cross being the highest award for gallantry in the British Army. And of those 28, a number were given to Gurkhas. I can't remember exactly the number, but a proportion went to Gurkhas, but also, to Hindus, to Sikhs, and to Muslims, a large amounts. So there is an injustice in the British popular memory that keeps Gurkhas in the memory while others are not there. And I think part of the reason for the fact that the Gurkhas do stay in the British popular memory is that they're still part of the British Army. So there are, even now, 75 years after the end of the war, there are still brigade of Gurkhas in the British Army who are regularly, they are attached to Sandhurst. They're, doing maneuvers on the hills of Devon, where I live. And they are seen on, marching on the streets, but also being part of the British effort in Afghanistan, in all kinds of post-war conflicts. So there's a kind of seam of popular experience that has seen them in the post-war context, and therefore I think that is transferred back to the in-war context, even though that the Gurkhas were only a relatively small part of the Indian Army during the Second World War. But there's definitely an imbalance there that I'm hoping to correct.
Are you planning a release in Pakistan of this book? Because I'm sure there'll be a great interest in Pakistan.
I hope so. It would be a great thing if we could make that happen. Absolutely, I know that from the people I've met and interviewed and people who've become friends in Pakistan, that they would really value the opportunity to see this book in the bookshops and in the libraries and the universities. So yeah, I hope so.
Well,
from your mouth to God's ears.
Ideally, this release should have been a joint India-Pakistan release, but such is the state of our politics. What to do? Is there a successor volume to this book, Dr. Bowman?
I hope so. I'm just starting to think about my next project, which is about Indian prisoners of war in Europe during the Second World War, and particularly the Great Escape, the Great Indian Escape.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our conversation. We had 30 minutes, exactly 30 minutes. So once again, let me say how delighted I was to read this book. This is a book that I normally would not have read, because military history is something that, quite far removed. I'm more into economic and political and social history. But I must say it was enthralling. And, I didn't put the book down once I started it. And I came away just so immensely educated by a slice of Indian political history. The Indian Army. I mean, it was the British Army, but it was an Indian contingent in the army. So it's absolutely delightful, and I wish to congratulate you on this book.